the New World becomes this concoction of different races that is really unlike anything you see in most parts of the world until perhaps the modern era. And it's a blend of African slaves, Native Americans who survive the devastation of smallpox, and the elite tiny population of Spaniards, mainly Spanish men, not immediately Spanish women, that will come later, but certainly that's important and significant to what we're talking about today because we'll be talking about the sexual blending of people, and the resulting blending will create a lot of paranoia among the Spanish who are afraid of a slave rebellion or an indigenous peoples rebellion. So a lot of conflict underlying this caste system that we'll look at today. Also remember that it won't be until the modern era, the 20th century, or maybe even the late 1800s, when the Native Americans will finally be celebrated as equal to the rest of Mexico and Mexicans after many centuries of being, subjugated and denied full access, full participation in owning land and employment, and just sort of having a normal status as a citizen of Mexico. So we will be chronicling this as we move forward, just giving you a heads up that we're going to see the status of the Native Americans fluctuate as Mexico undergoes the sort of growing pangs of modern life. So I want to start with this painting of Frida Kahlo, which is not from the period we're looking at, but is an interesting example of a painting that shows a kind of hybrid of two different cultures. So let me ask you guys, when you look at this, and this is one of my favorite artists. She's an artist from Mexico we'll be looking at later this semester. When you look at this, what do you see as the blend? What's being blended here? What two cultures are perhaps being blended in this painting? Don't worry if you're wrong, just kind of use your intuition. She split herself into two sides, and it's a external reflection of an internal conflict. Yeah, I think that's very well put. Spain and Mexico, and emphasis on the sort of aristocracy of Mexico, and perhaps the sort of indigenous aristocracy of Spain and the indigenous groups of Mexico. So Frida Kahlo, who, like many Mexicans, has some indigenous heritage, some indigenous blood, she feels an inner conflict between the two roots, her two roots, or her identity. One foot Spanish, the other foot indigenous. And this painting is a way of expressing that conflict and perhaps reconciling the two, or perhaps affirming the irreconcilability of the two. We will explore this painting later this semester, so I don't want to go too deep into it, but I want to offer that as perhaps an example, not a direct or even an obvious example, but perhaps can conceivably be seen as an example of a Casta painting, which is to say a painting that's all about categorizing people into maybe racial groups, or in this case, I think her reflecting on the troubles of categorization. Likewise, this painting here is from the 1920s, and by this is a painting by Orozco, another famous Mexican painter from the Mexican muralist movement during the Renaissance of Mexico in the 1920s. And again, this is an artist filtering his understanding of Mexican history through a kind of Casta painting like picture. So we'll revisit this painting and the previous one and give you a chance to consider whether these are perhaps a kind of take inspiration from the Casta painting. So what are the Casta paintings? Well, the Casta paintings are paintings painted in I think mainly in the late 1500s into the 1600s. And it's a way of making sense of the chaotic blending of people that occurs after the conquest of Mexico and after the death of so many Aztecs and Maya and other indigenous people, that the Spanish are forced, I say they're kind of mercilessly seek alternative sources of labor to make up for the vacuum left behind by the death of the Native Americans. So a very precipitous decline in population occurring in a relatively short period of time. And this decline leads to a labor shortage. And as we saw, I think last class, I mentioned that this guy, Bartolome de las Casas, who had joined Columbus in one of his early voyages to the New World, he writes a letter pleading on behalf of the Native Americans in Mexico and offers as an alternative source of labor importing African slaves. So that's a very tragic period, a moment. I think another tragic layer added to the beginning of the New World, starting with, of course, the death of the Native Americans, the conquest, and now the addition of slavery to the New World. And the paintings that we're going to look at are very different than the one you see, for instance, on the right with King Juan Carlos, or probably, I don't know if this Juan Carlos or Felipe Segundo, Philip II. I think perhaps, I'm not going to say which, but they're both very important. And, very typical. Typically you see a very rich person on some kind of horseback or standing, in front of their palatial mansion with their land ownings in the background. And that's very typical painting from the upper classes of this period. And again, we'll go back to that in a moment. So Bartolome de las Casas sends a letter supplicating, petitioning the king, begging him to replace Indian labor with African American labor, and especially in places like Brazil and the Caribbean, you see a lot of, millions of African slaves brought to the New World. Notably, Mexico doesn't receive a lot of these slaves because there isn't a lot of sugar production in Mexico. But even one slave, I think we can agree, is too many. And depending on which part of the New World you're in, you might see fewer or many or more slaves, and that really depends on the crop and the need for labor. And of course, all this results in this triangular trade of goods and slaves, exporting, importing. And this is really the kind of triangle of trade that emerges after Columbus's journey and after the conquest. And of course, this also layers on top of this expansion of the globe with the two oceans connected by Columbus's journey, of course, to the New World. And in the aftermath of all that, you have the government, the king, the crown, which is not just necessarily Spain. We have French Bourbon kings who take over the Spanish crown. So just keep in mind the aristocracy, including the monarchy, can be very out of touch with the typical member of the population of Spain or whatever country may be the case. And of course, the church is another major part of colonization in the colonial America, colonial Spain, and of course the Casta system, which is what we're going to talk about today, the hierarchy of people. And that has the Spanish on the top, the Peninsulares, followed by the Criollos, who are Spaniards born in the New World, as opposed to Spaniards born in Spain, which would be the Peninsulares, followed by the Indios, Mestizos. Mestizos are a blend of Native American and Spanish. And then below them, mulattoes, which we call probably mixed race today, and negros, blacks, African slaves. And I don't know who specifically enlists artists to start painting these paintings. I think it emerges kind of organically as a result of the paranoia about the kind of blending of people in the New World. And the result is kind of this exotic, almost postcard from the New World. And I think it depends on the picture to determine whether it's a more mean-spirited or more just purely based on taxonomy, or like kind of like a zoological categorization of people based on superficial differences. But it's a little more than that. But it's not much deeper than that. So I think there's something very odd about these paintings, because what's missing is the typical motive that you see with paintings, which is to tell a story about people, to celebrate them, or to talk about history or status, maybe in terms of politics, political status, or achievement. In this case, we're just looking at pictures of people who are really kind of like zoological examples of what happens when you blend one group with another. And the result is, of course, a child. And beyond that, you've got these backdrops which speak to the livelihood of the people involved and or their social status. And I think you'll see that in many cases where the higher you are on the hierarchy, the better the outcome, the more favorably the painter depicts the world, the world they inhabit. The lower you are on the spectrum, or the lower you're on the hierarchy, the less positively the painter portrays the subjects. It reminds me of social media, how superficial social media is, and how everything's kind of all one happy, everyone's happy, showing off things. It has that degree of superficiality and kind of almost contrivance to it, but a kind of different kind of contrivance. So remember, we talked about conversion and converting people using colors, using Aztec imagery. Well, keep in mind, we've moved well past that, and we're now into the age of colonization, where we have seen artists use paint to kind of dominate and to assert, psychologically assert Spanish Catholic control. Well, now this is a new form of control, or at least a way, maybe a pressure valve, releasing pressure about the paranoia of racial mixing. So we'll get back to this painting at the end, but it is eerily reminiscent of some of the things we'll be looking at today. So yeah, so here's one of our first examples. And you notice on the right, it says, de español or español y mestiza producen castiza. So basically, there's a little caption on the painting that says a Spaniard and a mestiza woman, a mix results in this kind of name for this kind of child. And you see in the background, it looks like they're in a home. Maybe he's writing letters. And when you look at this, does this look like a mean-spirited painting? Does this look like it's sort of looking down at these subjects here? Are we meant to look at these subjects and say, "Oh, what horrible people"? And someone says, "Oh, it's all quite all right, Justin. Welcome back." So I think you can see that it's kind of a loaded question because you could say, well, there's nothing conspicuously negative, and yet just the idea of categorizing people in terms of race, I think we can all agree is really kind of weird, if not disfavorable, distasteful to us today. Not to say that there won't be things that people find distasteful about us in the future, but for now, I think what is also notable is these aren't really real subjects. It doesn't look like the painter's painting based on observation, so much as coming up with like a cookie cutter version of a white Spaniard or a more darker skinned indigenous woman. And in this case, it looks kind of like a happy family. You know, the parrot is peaceful, the child is peaceful. But we'll see other examples. By the way, these are earlier examples on the left of etchings done to make sense of the world prior to Columbus. There's always been this interest in creating some kind of encyclopedia of human culture. And the Casta paintings are definitely one part that. But I think they're not just that. It's more than that. I think even today we kind of use the internet and social media to categorize or to make, exotic places and um, AI generating images of people doing things in different cultures that plays into stereotypes, that kind of thing. You always see those pictures of little kids in Africa making bottles into sculptures, and it's kind of playing on stereotypes and preying on, poverty, ideas about poverty and things like that. And so these pictures are definitely um, I think, kind of about about reinforcing stereotypes, but in a much more cruel world where the Spanish are really kind of the dominating, and everyone else is well below the Spanish in terms of the hierarchy. So here, for instance, you see, yeah, so these are actually done in the 1700s, up into the 1700s. So I was wrong a little earlier about the dates. I think probably 1600s, 1700s. This is the Bourbon period when the French crown, the French monarchies are actually in control of the Spanish crown. And so here you got a Spaniard with an African woman, and the result is this child. And again, this is another case where it doesn't seem to be too mean-spirited. It's more just matter of fact. And yet, it would be so weird. Imagine if you go on the internet and someone's posting pictures of, here's a black woman and a white guy, and the result is this kind of child. But as we'll see in a moment, it's also the behavior of the child that plays into these pictures. So these are pretty normal as far as there's nothing so overtly negative about the child's behavior. Likewise here, what I think is interesting to me is this backdrop behind them doesn't look at all like the New World. It's more like Europe, some kind of European painting. So the artists aren't really trying to be true, quote unquote, true to the subject matter. So it's really about a painting about reducing people to superficial skin color and then commenting on the value of that blending, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I think in this case, it's really not so bad because it's really all about where you are in the hierarchy. And again, I haven't shown you the more negative examples. And you notice that the exotic fruit down below, I think, is meant to show that these paintings are also acting as a kind of exotica, a form of exotica, showing parts of the world that are exotic and really emphasizing the kind of dreamy quality of the New World as being so different, but also so similar, so familiar because of the landscape they're doing behind them. And
I
like
was gonna state, if you don't mind me speaking, sir, I
anyone,
wanted to
anytime.
put in that it's also possible that it still takes place in the old world, but it's as if they were, or it's as if the people from the new world were brought back, perhaps.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that what you're saying, kind of what I see it, what you were saying that is they're kind of they're it's goes back to that paranoia about Spain. They need everything to be almost contextualized in a Spanish, a familiar Spanish looking or European looking background, because perhaps that diminishes how kind of chaotic it might seem otherwise to have just sort of this world emerging that's completely f beyond the control of the crown because it's so far away and so yeah, and just so it's so like you've let the cat out of the bag. I don't think that's necessarily what you were saying. You're kind of saying they're kind of going back to Europe, and the picture is kind of them in Europe. And I think that's interesting because that's almost like, yeah, let's bring back this exotic, like let's import this exotic thing from this other world and kind of bring it back to our homeland. And yeah, that it could be kind of the premise of the painting to kind of bring, and literally them to bring that the exotic elements of the new world back to to for the for the I guess judgment and joy or curiosity of aristocrats in Spain. Now I don't know too much about the audience that really these paintings were intended for. I think it was really intended for the aristocracy. Typically the only people who afford paintings are the aristocracy, and so probably the Creoles. Perhaps the Peninsulares, they were the ones who would kind of look at this and say, "Oh yeah, this is amusing because this is the sort of world that we're inhabiting now." And I think it's neat to see the actual like the dress here is so well painted, the details that I think you can't really say that all of these paintings are cruel and mean-spirited. I think the underlying premise you could say is, but this painting, for instance, has a lot of love. The artist is treating her dress with a lot of detail, and it really doesn't seem to treat her with much disdain the way other paintings will here. But you remember, in every case, it's a Spanish man with an indigenous woman or a different or a mulatta woman, but rarely is it a Spanish Spaniard with a Spanish woman, because that's just sort of then it would just be maybe a picture of nobility. So here we get our first more kind of disruptive example del albarazado or albarazado y salta atrás sale see this is like kind of tenel aire. So this is kind of old Spanish, like kind of equivalent of Shakespearean Spanish. And just to sort of digest that, it's basically just say this from this specific kind of category with this category you get this, and basically it's saying these two people from this lower class lower uh, 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 tier or on the spectrum or on the caste system results in a family that has just a lot of violence and a lot of domestic dispute. It looks like almost a kid is trying to stop the violence, but really I think here you get the first kind of mean-spirited painting where it's really showing you. I think you have to look at them all as a kind of spectrum or a collection of this is good, this is bad, this is okay, and they're all about kind of reaffirming the caste system. So definitely nothing happy about this picture, and even the background looks really kind of murky and blurry. Here, the African woman with the Spaniard, it says de español y negra sale mulatto. So that's a mulatto child and a mixed race child. And it looks like she's cooking and maybe about to spank the child. And then notice the kid's kind of running to the Spanish father for some kind of sympathy or compassion, and he's just chilling there smoking his Gandalf pipe. So yeah, it's really the Spaniard who's given this sort of almost like heavenly light, and the mom is kind of definitely looked at disfavorably here. I think if only because the child is running to the father here. From a Spaniard and a mulata sale morisco or morisca. So here's a Spaniard and a mixed race woman. You have a morisca, which is like a mix of the two, of course. And I think in this case, it looks like I'm not even sure. Do you have any idea what's going on? Is the guy saying like the child is too loud? It looks like he's kind of hushing her, and she's just sort of looks like, "Where have you been? I've got dinner ready." And here the child's kind of running to the mom. So this feels less disfavorable than the previous one, but nevertheless, I think again you see that it's all about the Spaniard being a symbol of peace and order and composure, and everyone else it's really kind of subordinate to him. Here it's what do we have? A mestiza and mulata. So definitely lower. And so not all they're not all mean-spirited because those are both pretty low on the rank. So no Spaniard here. You got a mixed race man with an indigenous woman with a mixed racial, a racially mixed man between African and European. Um, and the result is Cuadrilleron, which these are all just bizarre taxidermy for people. And this doesn't seem so mean-spirited. I mean, it seems pretty wholesome. He's holding a hibiscus. He's he's a cobbler or maybe a shoe. Yeah, cobbler. That's someone who makes shoes, right? And then you've got washing the baby's bottom. So it doesn't seem so mean-spirited as other examples. So even the doves, the two doves together, kind of imply some kind of harmony. Although it's kind of a funny mirror of the baby's butt cheeks, I gotta say. But yeah, really interesting paintings, yet interesting because they're so devoid of real humanity. Because it's not like we're really looking at Mr. Calderon and Senora Doña Calderon. These are really just sort of cookie cutters, kind of like things we saw in the 1300s with Giotto. Here we've got De Lobo y India, Sale Cambuja. And yeah, these are really bizarre terms that even most Mexicans probably don't know today because they're just sort of quirky language that was meant to kind of categorize people. Like the way people use the word Karen today, like it's just sort of a mean-spirited term to look down. It's based on certain groups and there's some humor value to it. So in this case, it seems pretty wholesome. So I think it really depends on the artist, how much sort of what you're supposed to extract from the tone of the painting, but you kind of have to look at them all in context and understand them as part of the caste system, of course. But you notice a lot of little details around, flowers, fruit. That looks like a chirimoya, actually, the really tasty cantaloupe-like fruit with big seeds, and but exotic food, exotic drinks, exotic things, but some things that are familiar, like the activities. He's like clearly some kind of person who's maybe got a carriage or maybe a carpenter. So there are things that are familiar. This case, they're clearly, more rustic and maybe more in the countryside. And, it's almost like a mirror image of the blending that you see in the foreground with the three dishes blending some kind of sauce. And that really mirrors the blending of people in the background. This is an interesting case on the right. This says de albina y español torna atrás. So basically, you've got an albino woman. Albino is the absence of pigment, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's an interesting case because you have an indigenous woman who's albino, so that she looks European, at least in the sense of skin color, and that's why the child is darker skin. So they're also kind of just, they're really clearly so enslaved to this idea of external superficial skin color that they're even using kind of albino as kind of a category when we all know that's kind of more of a medical condition, if you will. And on the left, you've got a drunken dad stumbling home. And the mom and the kid trying to maybe resuscitate him. So another mean-spirit example, very typical what you see from, someone who's kind of really trying to make you look down at the lower rungs of the caste system. And, it's interesting kind of nod to some of the things we saw earlier this semester with the Bonampak mural showing the hierarchy and people down below, seen as lower status, people above seen it. So it's kind of an update. Mexico hasn't changed that much from the one on the left and the one on the right. It's still very much defined by kind of racial or at least kind of hierarchy and kind of fascism or kind of tyranny. I shouldn't say fascism, tyranny, the tyranny of power. In this case, on the left, the tyranny of the guy with all the might and all the strength and the military power. On the right, of course, is a tyranny of the Spanish, who are the elite ruling class and rule over everyone else. So I'll just go through a few more examples to and kind of if you've seen 20, you've seen them all. So from a Spaniard and a black, you get a mixed race. So again, it's really trying to, I think, thoroughly represent all the different groups. So you really get a kind of clear sense of the vocabulary and why this child is called what she's called. Yet still, in spite of that, wonderful treatment of the dress and the details and the clothing. So it's much more than just kind of a mean-spirited caricature. It is somewhat of a caricature, but it's also a painting where the artist is showing off their talent uh, and skills. Likewise here, I mean, there's some pretty impressive things you see here, detail-wise, and like I said, here's you got Oh, that's interesting. A Spanish and a Morisca, and then you get an albina. So I don't. They probably weren't even aware of the genetics of albinoism. But that clearly was part of the categories there. It is kind of like looking at considering the debate between nurture and nature. Here we've got people who are really extremely on the nature side of things, like eugenics or genetics, where if you just assume genetics is 100% responsible for the outcome, then that's kind of what you're seeing here. People who think that the way you're born determines your existence in life. So very much about kind of almost a predestination based on genetics before genetics was even invented or discovered as part of human nature. Here you've got another kind of obstreperous kind of wife with a Spanish husband, and a child is kind of crying. Likewise here. Now, this is a rare example of a Spanish woman with a mulatto, a mixed race husband. And I think the whole point here is to say that this woman made a mistake marrying this guy, even though he's a stagecoach. Look at this sort of domestic violence that's so characteristic of this home. Whereas on the right, this seems a lot more positive. So basically, it's kind of saying this is actually Chino, so someone of Chinese descent. As long as they stay in their lane and marry someone of Indian descent, they'll have a happy life. But if someone goes disrupting the hierarchy, like on the left with a Spanish woman with a mulatto, you get this domestic violence. So I think you get the idea that peace is all about staying in your lane and having a Spanish man in control of everything, at least in terms of these paintings. Likewise here. De Español, India produce mestizo. Yeah, now we're in the age of the wigs, those kind of aristocratic wigs that you see right up into the 1700s. Pretty beautiful dress. I mean, really exquisite paintings. Remember, these are definitely lower quality than things perhaps you see in Europe. Um, but it's really the faces that I think are the most cookie cutter and unimpressive to me. It's everything else is quite fabulous and wonderful, with some exceptions. I mean, even the way she's painted, I think is pretty, wonderful. But I still feel like I'm not looking at real people. I'm looking at cookie cutter people who are meant to just stand in for, the race that they represent. This is de Español, Albina. So yeah, the dresses, you notice they're definitely some of the artists are really good about the details on dresses. And here we've got another case of look, they've got the sign on the kitchen wall there. Negro, Chino, I can't see that name. Genitada. Um, it's funny, jinitera is actually a word in Cuba for someone who's gay. So that might be the word genitera might be a play off of that word might still be part of Cuban vocabulary. But another unhappy family. So in this case, I can't say if it's, you would think, oh, they're all marrying in their rank, so there shouldn't be a unhappiness. And yet, obviously, I think they're trying to show that if there's any kind of African element to it, perhaps that's, they're clearly using stereotypes and being racist about the lower part of the caste system there. And there is a, legitimate paranoia. There will be a slave rebellion in Haiti. And so, there, and of course there should be, because, slavery is an abominable institution. And so I think you can see underlying all this is this kind of desire to deal with the paranoia about races not being sufficiently converted to sort of Spanish lifestyle. And we'll see this later, like with Frida Kahlo on the right. That's a picture of her being nursed by an indigenous woman. And you see a lot of that in Mexico, maybe not in the United States, where you might hire an indigenous woman to take care of a Spanish child and be nursed by the indigenous woman. And yeah, so here's another example of the African. So not in all cases where there's Africans involved is it negative. So I think it might depend on the artist. In the lower right, you've got real, full-on indigenous people. So really, I think you see the whole range, a lot of different possibilities, of course, and yet none of them really feel like real people. And what's interesting to me too is, the more, in some cases, you see children learning to read. I think there's actually another example I don't have here, and I don't know why. But these children that you see here, these children will go on to be that first generation that declares independence against Spain when Napoleon invades Spain and puts his brother on the crown of Spain. All of the Spanish colonies declare independence because they don't want to swear allegiance to a French monarch. At least not an invader like Napoleon, who isn't, legitimate monarchy. I say that with some irony because, of course, the Bourbons were French, but they were legitimate. They weren't a kind of usurper like Napoleon, who rose from the ranks of the artillery and wasn't nobility. And going back now to Malinche and Cortez, I think you can understand why I think Orozco was very much aware of the Casta paintings and kind of channeling that. But would you say, is this so we have Cortez and Malinche together, and the result is this kind of stillborn, if not kind of defeated indigenous person down below them that's kind of being stomped on. So is this identical to the Costa paintings we just saw, or is there something slightly different about this? Definitely loaded question. So remember, we talked about this as being almost like an Adam and Eve, channeling Adam and Eve, the idea of the founders of Mexico are this sort of nude male and female, Cortez and Malinche. So I think what makes this different from the Costa paintings is the fact that this isn't an artist just showing, oh, from Spaniard and indigenous woman, you get this kind of baby. You could say that's visually kind of seems to be what we're looking at, but really it's more him commenting on the birth of Mexico and kind of using a Costa painting as perhaps a reference point. But really drawing from a different place morally, ethically. He's coming at this from a point of view of the Spanish, I think, being dominant and I think coercive. And it's not really a painting about the exotic qualities of Mexico, but really just a matter of fact, the blending of Spanish and dominating the Native American woman sexually, and of course, dominating the offspring that come from that. So I think it's really not a Costa painting in the strict sense of the word, but I do think he's channeling some of that Costa painting quality and redeploying it to make sense of Mexico's origins. The origin based on, of course, the conquest and everything that came thereafter. And then, of course, that brings us back. And it kind of reminds me of this painting of St. Matthew killing the dragon, stepping on the bad guy. You've got here Cortez stepping on the indigenous figure down below who's face down. And that brings us full circle back to Frida Kahlo. So this is painted in 1939 by Frida Kahlo. And I think you can understand, even if this is not a Casta painting, she's kind of using the same idea of visualizing the union of two halves, and you are kind of left with considering, well, what is the final outcome? There's no child here, there's no sexual intercourse, and yet she's splitting herself into two halves as a way to externalize that inner conflict. And so it looks maybe like something that could be mistaken for a Casta painting, but obviously it's not because it's not about marriage so much as the nature of the new world and the inhabitants of the new world having to make some kind of having to assimilate and or find some kind of harmony in spite of the inner conflict, perhaps between race, whether indigenous or not, maybe your religion or not. And I think all of you, all of us in the new world, whether you're from Mexico or not, it really doesn't matter because we all feel this sense of, well, are you modern or do you assert your cultural roots? Do you assimilate into, a lot of the United States is about assimilating into English speaking and obeying the rules, and that requires kind of letting go, perhaps, of the culture from which you originate, depending on how many generations removed you are. So I think this speaks to more of us than we realize, because Frida Kahlo, in her case, is reconciling the European side with the indigenous side. But in your case, maybe it's, well, you maybe have roots from Europe or from Asia or from other parts of Africa, and you have to kind of decide where how much of that matters to you now, how much of you based on maybe your modern, are you a US citizen, or do you assert your cultural roots? And I think you all, each of you has a distinct sort of story about how much your own internal hierarchy of what matters the most to you. Maybe your identity matters more than your national origin, more than your culture, but that might be different for your parents, right, or for your grandparents. And so each of us has to kind of do what Frida Kahlo is doing, which is find some kind of peace, inner peace, or some kind of balance between your ethnic or religious identity or cultural identity and being modern and being part of this world that we live in today with the internet and everything. So I think this speaks much more to the new world than it does to the old world, Africa, Asia, and Europe, because what's so definitively new world about this is blending people and finding some kind of balance with that blending of different groups. So we will continue talking about this because it's so important to the new world to understand this. And this will lead to the Mexican Revolution, the US Revolution, and any other revolutions in the new world because of the tension around all these different elements and the histories that all converge in the new world. So let's end on that point, and I will see you guys on Monday, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, very good. Well, you guys have a great day, and I'll see you on Monday. And just make sure you do your homework, which is writing your introduction